As a newly widowed Lydia grappled with the overwhelming loss of her husband, she found herself repeatedly drawn to the film she had made of his funeral. After watching it several times, she noticed something extraordinary, something that would push her to consider the unthinkable. The funeral had just occurred the day before, and Lydia was devastated by the suddenness of her husband's passing, leaving her with a profound sense of unfinished business. She had recorded the funeral for her son, who was serving abroad in the army, and though she had been there for the entire event, she couldn't help but rewatch it on her computer just a day later. What she discovered left her utterly terrified. As she closely examined the beautiful coffin she had chosen for her husband, she noticed what appeared to be pressure from within. It took her a few minutes to fully process, but after rewinding the video and watching it again and again, she became convinced. The lid of the coffin seemed to pulsate, as if something inside was trying to force it open. This shocking discovery left Lydia afraid to confirm her suspicions with anyone else, fearing they would think she was mad. She wondered if she was simply seeing things, perhaps finding a reasonable explanation for what she was seeing. However, the more she thought about it, the more realistic it seemed. After an hour of pacing and going over the situation in her mind, she came to the emotional conclusion that perhaps her husband was still alive. A large part of her wanted to believe this theory. She desperately hoped that there was a small chance her husband was alive in the coffin, perhaps through some type of miracle. This thought tormented her. The rational side of her told her she was being silly and that her grief and sleep deprivation were causing her to imagine things. But the emotional, anxious side persisted. What if she wasn't crazy? What if he had been buried alive? If that were the case, she knew she could never live with herself for not checking, so she set out to do the unthinkable. Lydia never considered herself a crazy person. In fact, she often prided herself on her rationality and calmness. But this time, those qualities were nowhere to be found. She blamed the hysteria of losing her husband. Surely, this was normal. She made a plan to visit the cemetery that evening, knowing she would need the cover of night to hide what she was about to do. Of course, if her husband was alive, her actions would be completely justified, but on the slim chance that he was truly dead, it wouldn't be a good look for Lydia. She weighed her options carefully. The minute it was dark enough, she was there, ready to dig up her husband's grave, something she never thought she would ever do in her entire life. Thankfully, since it was freshly dug, she didn't have to do too much work. She just had to get all the sand off the coffin before security came around. It took her almost an hour to uncover, of course, the coffin. With each shovel of sand she threw over her shoulder, she thought about the possibility of her husband being alive. How could this have happened? He had been declared dead by a doctor, though the circumstances around his death were still unclear. Lydia remembered that the doctors had hypothesized that he had ingested something he was allergic to, which had caused his heart to stop. Of course, Lydia had been skeptical from the start. In all the years she had known her husband, he had never had any allergies. Someone had suggested that he might have been suffering from too much stress at work, which she could believe, given the conflicts he had been experiencing. When he died, Lydia suspected that someone had poisoned him, but when she vocalized this to friends, family, and the authorities, they simply laughed at her. This too had been difficult for her to deal with. Suddenly, her shovel hit the coffin with blunt force. She wasn't expecting the grave to be so shallow. She quickly went to work trying to open the coffin. It was quite difficult, as the lid was snugly fit into the base. She eventually wedged the spade into the side and leveraged it against the lid, lifting it with a pop. The coffin opened up, and immediately, Lydia's eyes welled with tears. Beneath her was her husband's face, still and peaceful. She remembered the first time she had met him. They had known each other since high school. Even in this situation, she couldn't help but admire how good he looked. At first glance, she thought she'd have gone mad. There beneath her was her seemingly dead husband, whom she had just disrespected and disturbed. How could she have done this? She immediately became extremely angry with herself. How could she have followed such a crazy whim? Of course, her husband was dead. Who was she to question the integrity of a medical professional? Her eyes now welled further with tears, but this time out of frustration rather than sadness. She was just about to close the coffin when she noticed something. His chest was moving ever so slightly. Initially, she thought her eyes were deceiving her, but after a closer look, she realized she was right. In a rush, she pulled out a pocket mirror from her bag and placed it under her husband's nose. To her astonishment, a faint fog appeared and then vanished. He was alive. Practically screaming with joy, she leaned over and shook him as hard as she could. Although he didn't open his eyes, he let out a small moan. He was alive, but just barely. She knew she needed to get help immediately. Her frantic screams quickly drew the attention of the cemetery's guardian, who was shocked to find her in the dug-up grave. But when she showed him that her husband was indeed still alive, he called the police and an ambulance. It was a difficult task to lift him out of the grave and into the ambulance, but after several attempts, they succeeded. They rushed him to the nearest hospital. His vitals were dangerously weak, and though she had found him alive, keeping him that way would be a challenge. The paramedics repeatedly asked Lydia how he had been buried alive, but she had no answers. She was overwhelmed with guilt, knowing he had likely struggled to escape the coffin at his own funeral, but no one had noticed. The fear he must have felt was unimaginable. After hours of intense work, the doctors finally stabilized him. Lydia's husband was conscious once again and on the road to recovery. Upon further investigation, the doctors found that someone had tried to poison him, but the poison had failed. Instead, it had caused his pulse to become so extremely faint that everyone had thought he was dead. By the time the poison began to wear off, it was too late. He was already in the coffin. The person who had poisoned him would have gotten away with it had Lydia not filmed the proceedings and watched it several times. Lydia's husband told her how hard he had fought to get out of the coffin before running out of air. He told Lydia that if she hadn't arrived when she did, he really would have ended up dead, and no one would have known a thing. Lydia was consumed with dread. The thought of her husband being buried alive made her feel physically ill. She couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if she hadn't recorded the funeral, if she hadn't watched the video and noticed the subtle movement. Her husband wouldn't be with her now. A thorough investigation was launched at his workplace to uncover the reason behind the poisoning. The findings were shocking. One of her husband's colleagues had attempted to kill him to cover up evidence of corruption. The colleague was horrified to learn that his plan had failed and that Lydia's husband had survived against all odds. It's incredible how a single moment of instinct can change everything. If Lydia hadn't followed her intuition and acted on what she saw in the video, this story would have had a very different ending. Would you have trusted your gut and dug up the grave or dismissed it as irrational? I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this story, so please don't hesitate to share your insights in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and found it engaging, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more similar content. Feel free to share this video. Take good care of yourselves, and I'm excited to connect with you in our future videos.